content of the following program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. I'm an attorney with the law firm Oltmann, Flynn & Kubler, where we specialize in intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights, as well as elder law. You can check us out online and view all episodes of this show on our website at oltmannpatent.com. That's oltmanpatent.com. I'd also like to acknowledge our other sponsor, Fresh Start Tax. Fresh Start Tax offers a full range of accounting services, including basic tax returns, wage garnishments, and any other tax-related concern. You can find out more by visiting their website, freshstarttax.com. I'd like to thank all of our listeners this evening, including those of you tuning in on the AM dial, as well as those watching online. If you have a question, comment, or story that you would like to share on the air, please feel free to call us toll-free at 888-565-1470. Once again, that toll-free number is 888-565-1470. We welcome your calls. I have a very special guest in studio this evening. His name is Jeff Molinaro. Jeff was on the show before where we were discussing the proposed amendment for medical marijuana last year, which did not pass. This evening, we're going to be discussing the recent developments in U.S.-Cuba relations, otherwise known as the Cuba thaw. Jeff specializes in commercial litigation, customs and trade law, anti-money laundering law, as well as tax law. So, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
So, we've had these recent developments and the regulatory changes to U.S.-Cuba relations, otherwise known as the Cuban thaw. If you could explain the background to these recent developments.
Sure. To realize where we are is we need to take a step back and say where we were. And since the 1960s, there's been an embargo in place on the Cuban government, on trade with Cuba, on doing business with Cuba, traveling to and from Cuba, importing and exporting goods, moving money back and forth. That's been in place since the 60s. And until the 90s, that was really controlled mostly by the executive branch, by the president, and by the Department of Treasury. In the 1990s, we actually saw the pressure on the Cuban government increase with the passage of the Helms-Burton Act. Helms-Burton did several things, but most importantly, it codified the embargo. It made the embargo a part of the United States Code. It made it law. So where we are now is the embargo is a U.S. law prohibiting certain trade with Cuba. What we saw under the Obama administration, as you referred to it as the Cuban thaw, is in December, the Obama administration decided to change the regulations that are in place for doing business in Cuba, traveling to Cuba, sending money to Cuba. What I think our listeners need to understand is that the embargo is still in place, and the embargo's still law, while there may be changes and while there may be easing of tensions between the two countries. We're still a long way from free and open travel, free and open movement of money, free and open movement of goods and services between Cuba and the United States. But the revisions are significant because they will provide for more travel opportunities. They will provide for banking and financial institutions to go into Cuba and operate. They will allow Cubans here to send more money to Cuban relatives there, injecting more U.S. capital into the pockets of Cuban nationals. And it also provides for greater exposure and access to telecommunications and to internet access. All are part of the larger goal of the embargo, which is to punish the regime, yet at the same time try to benefit the Cuban people.
Right, and that's an important goal of the embargo, is to punish the regime because of its human rights records and so forth. The Cuban thaw that we've seen here is to try to help the Cuban people who are living there. So if we could talk a little bit about some of those changes. One of the biggest changes is that there's now going to be new ways to travel to Cuba that were not previously available. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Correct. And it's not so much that there are new ways, it's that the access to those ways is much easier. The embargo provides for things called licenses, essentially permissions to do things with the Cuban government or with the people of Cuba, to travel, do banking, so on and so forth. And they can be either general or specific. And a general license is essentially if you're doing an activity that qualifies under the law for an exception, you can engage in that without asking permission from the U.S. government. You can freely travel. Specific licenses, on the other hand, you had to ask for specific permission. You would have to file a request with the federal government. The U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, they are the ones that control the Cuban embargo. They're the ones that supervise it. They're the regulatory regime in charge. They are the ones that would approve your specific licenses. With the changes, the recent regulations that were published this past week, what we've seen is 12 broad categories have been changed to allow for a general license, meaning that if you qualify for the specific details, if you meet the criteria, you can travel. And they're broad and they're diverse. They're everything from education to sports and entertainment, religious purposes, very broad ideas. Now, what needs to be recognized is general tourism is prohibited. It's still prohibited, and that's the interplay that we're having right now in this period of thawing, is there are certain things that are prohibited in the embargo, and there are certain things that we're easing up on, making it easier to travel. The idea is for a cultural exchange, the government has said, between the American people and the Cuban people.
Now, how about business-related ventures? Because one of the interesting regulatory developments is it's now going to have more expanded licensing for financing and microfinancing and potential imports into Cuba. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I think related to that is the idea of three topics. One is spending in Cuba. People who travel to Cuba can now spend more money in Cuba. There's no longer a per diem if you go to Cuba on a general license. You can spend as much as you want per day. There's no dollar limit. There used to be a dollar limit as how much you could spend per day and per trip in American dollars in Cuba. That's been changed. You can also now import with you or bring back with you up to $400 in Cuban goods, including up to $100 in alcohol or tobacco products. But what's interesting is, once again, you have that interplay. You can't bring in a Cuban cigar or Cuban rum from the Bahamas. You can't bring it in from Mexico. You can't bring it in from Trinidad. But you can bring it in if you travel to Cuba. It's a way of injecting capital to the private citizens of Cuba, and that's why they made this change.
Now, how is that distinct from bringing in a cigar from Mexico or Trinidad or the Bahamas for purposes of injecting capital?
Well, the money you're spending when you buy a cigar in Mexico or Trinidad is going to Mexico or Trinidad. It's going to the shop you bought it at in the airport versus injecting it directly, buying it directly in Cuba. The other thing related to finance is the remittances, the amount of money that can be sent to Cuba by Cubans to their relatives in Cuba. The old rule was $500 per quarter, about $2,000 a year. That number's been dramatically increased. You can now send up to $8,000 a year, $2,000 per quarter. So we see a dramatic increase in the amount of money that can go into Cuba. On top of that, like you were discussing earlier, banking and finance, the financial services industry is greatly expanded. Under the old rules, money services businesses, think money transmitters like a Western Union or a check cashing store, anybody that moves money back and forth that's not a bank, under the old rules, they needed specific permission from the federal government. They needed a specific license, like we were talking about earlier, to engage in business in Cuba, to send money, send those remittances to Cuba. Because remember, we don't send $2,000 in an envelope overseas.
Right.
We send it through a courier service, or we send it through a money transmitting service. And before, you needed special permission from the government to engage in it. Now, if you can meet the criteria, you automatically qualify and you can begin engaging in business under a general license. Also interesting to note, American banks can now go into Cuba and actively engage in business there. Now, typically in a bank, what happens is if a foreign bank wants to do business in a country, they establish a correspondent account. Under the old rules, U.S. banks could not establish correspondent accounts in Cuba. Under the new rules, you have correspondent accounts being allowed for Bank of America or Bank Atlantic or any other U.S. bank. They can now open up a correspondence account, which means they can now send money and hold money there. People who have American bank accounts who travel to Cuba, because there's no limit on how much you can spend, will need cash. They can now go get cash at a Bank of America. They don't need it wired in. So it vastly expands the amount of capital that can go to these areas in Cuba.
And probably in the process, it will reduce the amount of fees and overhead associated with transferring money. You don't have to pay for a wire transfer every time that you're sending remittances down.
It's possible. You also have the idea of open access, maybe the market competing against each other. It may become cheaper to do business because there are more people now engaged in the business of sending money to Cuba. Another quirk in the rule, while American banks can establish correspondence accounts in Cuba, Cuban banks, to the extent there are, cannot open correspondent accounts in the United States. So the banking can only really go one direction right now.
So, and there's also going to be developments in the telecommunications industry. Now we might be seeing American companies building cell towers or other internet infrastructure in Cuba where that wasn't previously available.
Correct. Now, it's interesting to note that historically, the area that has been broad and open under these general licenses, under these permissions to do business, has been telecommunications. And it's the idea of, if we can inject access to the outside world, to the Cuban people, we can influence the politics in Cuba and help end the regime. That's been expanded. Now the ability to engage in providing internet-based communications, providing services incidental to internet-based communications, really has been expanded broadly under the new rules. Again, it's a general license, so if you meet the qualifications of the specific regulation, you can engage in business. Now, I encourage people who are in business, who are thinking about seeing whether they qualify. Maybe they do telecommunications. Maybe they work in an internet-based service. Maybe they provide supplemental support to an internet-based service. They may provide the actual hardware and software, and they're saying, well, this could be an opportunity for the future. You should speak to somebody who has a good understanding of the regulations. Look at them yourself. They're under 31 CFR Part 515. Take a look, and if you feel like this is something that, hey, I think my business may be interested, you should talk to legal counsel, somebody who specializes, like our firm does, in engaging in business in countries that are under sanctions regimes, whether it be Cuba, whether it be Syria, whether it be Iran, whether it be other countries on the watch list. So those are issues that businesses need to pay attention to. Also something that's interesting, speaking on travel and banking, now, because of the correspondence accounts, because of the access to capital, you also have the ability to use credit cards and debit cards in Cuba. Now, that's going to vary based on your bank, but you'll have, people who travel will have that opportunity as well.
And just to clarify, we've been talking about the recent developments. They've been through the executive branch or through executive order changes to the regulations, which is something that the President of the United States is in charge of. But the actual embargo itself, like you mentioned, is a law passed by Congress. So this is an example of the president changing regulations within the bounds of the law passed by Congress. He is not in a position, President Obama or any president for that matter, to terminate the embargo. That's something that Congress would have to do.
Correct. And what you constantly and consistently heard is out of Congress is that's not happening anytime in the future. So you have an interesting dynamic between an executive branch right now that it's expanding trade with Cuba and a more conservative Congress that wants to keep the embargo in place. Another issue that you also have is where does it go in the next administration? Because regulations can always be modified. So businesses have to pay attention if they're engaging in business that requires a general license. Good example, the airline industry. Now, we've expanded travel. Does that mean tomorrow I'm going to be able to hop on a U.S. Air flight or a Delta flight, book it on Expedia, and go down to Cuba if I meet a general license? No, it's not. There's a lot of supplemental legal issues that have to be cleared up. Right now, you're still going to have to get a charter flight and fly down to Cuba. And the big reason for that is because the United States and the Cuban government have never agreed to allowing international flights back and forth on a commercial basis. That has to be worked out by international treaty. Those routes need to be approved by the FAA. So we're a long way off from really normalizing relations. I think there was a lot of noise and fodder that, oh, this is the end of the embargo, or this is a good thing, or this is a bad thing. And I think it's a small step towards something different, but it's not a wholesale change because it's still illegal for tourists to travel to Cuba. You know, it's still illegal to do business in Cuba right now. You can't just import and export goods. I can't tomorrow ship 50 air conditioners down there, or 50 carburetors, or 50 engines, or 50 of anything else and bring in. It's still prohibited by the embargo. So where the change is going to be little by little through maybe the creation of general licenses to allow for broader access into Cuba. And I think it's still going to be an experiment on what these general licenses will lead to, especially in banking and travel.
I'm going to have to stop you there for a minute. We have to go to break to hear from our sponsors, and we're going to be back to talk about the legal implications of the recent developments in U.S.-Cuba relations. Please stay tuned.
This program is brought to you by Fresh Start Tax. Fresh Start Tax offers a full range of tax and accounting services, including tax return preparation and bookkeeping, as well as back taxes, wage garnishments, unfiled returns, or any other tax-related concern. Our dedicated team of tax attorneys, CPAs, and former IRS agents offer over 60 years of professional tax experience. For a free consultation, call 866-700-1040. That's 866-700-1040. You can also visit us on the web at freshstarttax.com. This program is brought to you by the law firm of Altman, Flynn, and Kubler. Our law firm specializes in elder law and intellectual property, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. If you would like to patent your idea, please contact our Fort Lauderdale office for a free consultation. We offer elder law services, including estate planning, long-term care planning, and preparation of healthcare documents. We strive to plan for your future needs while allowing you to retain as much dignity and independence as possible. To find out more or to make an appointment, call 954-563-4814. That's 954-563-4814. Or visit us online at altmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. Spokesperson, not an attorney. You're listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, back to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese.
And we're back. This is Jeff Van Treese from Talk Legal. We've been discussing the recent developments in U.S.-Cuba relations. I'm My guest this evening is Jeff Molinaro. We were talking before the break about some of the legal implications of the recent developments, and I'd like to turn to the Cuban Claims Act, which is an interesting policy mechanism that allows for businesses and individuals that had their property seized when Castro took over in the early 60s, or the late 50s actually, and allows for people to make claims against frozen U.S. assets that the U.S. government has control over. So I'd like it if you could give our listeners an introduction to that and how these new developments play a role.
Sure. Really, you see, with claims, I think we have to realize that in the 60s, when we started the Foreign Settlement Commission, the big players were involved. When the Cuban government came in, they nationalized everything. They took homes of private citizens, businesses of private citizens. They also took businesses and property of multinational corporations, be it Bacardi, be it Shell, be it Coca-Cola, or otherwise. And the big players in the 60s went through that process of certifying their claims and saying they lost X millions of dollars in sugar plantations or oil rights or property. But the question is that you commonly get asked is, well, what about my family? We lost our farm, we lost our business, we lost our home in Cuba. Those issues are far off into the future. Those issues, when you looked historically at other areas of the world, those issues require several things to change. One is the U.S. government obviously would have to be amenable to perhaps taking pennies on the dollar because it's a claims tribunal. Second is you need internal change within Cuba. Not only do you need a complete regime change for that to occur, you need a change in the economic system for that to occur. You also are going to need a change in the legal code in those countries. When you look at other countries that this has occurred in, like Nicaragua or Vietnam, those changes came from within. Those tribunals were set up by those countries. Nicaragua set up their own process with their own tribunals and their own laws to allow for property that was expropriated to or taken away to be settled, those claims. Now, it's important to note that within Helms-Burton itself, it says in order to...
Just to clarify for our listeners, Helms-Burton is the Cuban embargo.
Correct, correct. In order to fully normalize relations, outstanding claims, there must be a process set up for outstanding claims to be rectified. Right. But that process is probably the furthest out of everything that's going on in Cuba and the changes in Cuba, as well as where do we go from here from an American standpoint, or somebody here looking to do business there.
Now, if we're looking at international trade, one of the things that allows for trade to take place between different countries is that the laws are understood and are going to be reliable from one country to the next. And for example, we have the Convention on the International Sale of Goods and similar laws and treaties that allow for trade to take place. In Cuba, there isn't any laws or treaties that they're necessarily members of that businesses can rely on. Is this going to be an issue?
Well, I think the first thing we have to realize is the embargo still prohibits day-to-day business with Cuba, import and export. But the model that Cuba will end up going to, we think, is the same that we've seen played out throughout the world when there's regime change, be it doing business in a country that had a dictatorship, doing business in Latin America, doing business in the old Eastern Bloc. How do you do business in a country that was completely nationalized, that's shifting to capitalism? If it gets to that point, how do you engage in business with people who don't have credit? Now, what we see is there could be a groundwork for this, and the government could be getting their ducks in a row. Why? Because we're allowing more banking, and we're allowing more money to go down to Cuban family members. So what American business owners need to do is realize that the big boys probably aren't jumping in first. So if you're a small or medium business owner, this could be the opportunity to start getting your ducks in a row. And what do I mean by that? One is, if you're in Miami, you're dealing with the Latin American market. Using your Latin American contacts to establish a customer base or learn about the customer base that's potentially there in Cuba. And once the embargo is lifted, engaging in business through your international partners in order to access that marketplace.
We'll have to leave it there. This has been a fascinating discussion. Jeff, if you could tell our listeners how they could contact you in the event that they're in need of your services.
Sure. The best way to contact me is by phone. Our phone number is 305-350-5690.
I'd like to give a very special thanks to my guest this evening, Jeff Molinaro. Tune in next week for another edition of Talk Legal, where my guest will be Ed Ricci, personal injury attorney, where we will be discussing uninsured motorist coverage. This has been Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. Please tune in next week. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material of this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its host, guests, and